The amber glow of the on-air sign cast shadows across the cramped radio booth as midnight approached in downtown Portland, Oregon. Behind the soundproof glass, Henry Coleman adjusted his headphones and leaned into the vintage microphone that had been his companion for over 15 years. At 62, Henry had the kind of voice that wrapped around listeners like a warm blanket, deep, measured, with the gentle authority of someone who'd lived through enough stories to understand pain. Good evening, Portland. You're listening to KPDX, and this is Midnight Melodies with your host, Henry Coleman. His fingers moved across the console with practiced ease, fading out a Chopin nocturne. It's 12:03 a.m., and if you're awake with me tonight, you're not alone. Whether you're driving the late shift, caring for a sick loved one, or just can't quiet your mind, this is your place. The phone lines glowed softly in the dim booth. 3 calls waiting. Henry had learned that midnight was when people's defenses came down, when the darkness made honesty easier. He'd built his show around that vulnerability, creating a sanctuary for insomniacs, shift workers, and souls too restless for sleep. Let's go to Sarah in Northeast Portland. Sarah, you're on the air. A trembling voice filled the booth. Henry, I just wanted to thank you. My husband passed last month, and I can't sleep in our bed anymore. Your show keeps me company. Henry's chest tightened. Sarah, I'm so sorry for your loss. Tell me about him. What was his favorite song? As Sarah talked about her late husband's love for jazz, Henry queued up Miles Davis's Blue and Green. He'd done this dance 1,000 times, listening, validating, offering the gift of being heard. But tonight felt different. Tonight, something was shifting in the carefully constructed world he'd built inside this booth. The radio station occupied the second floor of a converted warehouse in Portland's industrial district. During the day, KPDX buzzed with morning show hosts, news anchors, and advertising salespeople. But from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., the building belonged to Henry. He preferred it that way. The solitude suited his temperament and his past. Henry lived alone in a modest apartment 10 minutes from the station. No pets, few friends, just shelves lined with vinyl records and books he'd collected over decades of midnight shifts. His ex-wife, Margaret, had left him 12 years earlier, tired of competing with a job that demanded his emotional energy when the rest of the world slept. You give more of yourself to strangers than you ever gave to me, she'd said. She wasn't wrong. The truth was, Henry found it easier to care for people he'd never meet. Distance made compassion safer. In the booth, he could offer wisdom without risking his own heart. He could be the steady voice in the storm without having to weather anyone else's chaos in return. His routine was rigid. Arrive at 10:30 p.m., review the night's playlist, check weather reports, scan news feeds for overnight stories. At 11 p.m. sharp, he'd flip the switch and become the Henry Coleman his listeners needed. Wise, patient, unshakable. At 6 a.m., he'd hand the airwaves over to the morning crew and drive home to sleep through the day. Tonight, though, as he took his third call, a truck driver struggling with loneliness on Interstate 84, Henry felt a familiar ache. 15 years of other people's pain had left deposits in his soul. Sometimes he wondered who listened to the listeners. KPDX, you're on with Henry. Henry, it's Marcus. I'm not sure I can do this anymore. The weight in the caller's voice made Henry sit up straighter. He'd learned to recognize the different flavors of despair, and this one carried the particular heaviness of someone at the edge. Marcus, I'm here. Take your time. I lost my job 6 months ago, lost my apartment last week. I'm sitting in my car outside a bridge, and I keep thinking, maybe it would be easier if I just... Henry's training kicked in. Years of late-night crisis calls had taught him how to hold space for the darkest thoughts. Marcus, I hear you. You're carrying so much right now, but you called me instead of driving onto that bridge. That tells me part of you is still fighting. For 20 minutes, Henry talked Marcus through the immediate crisis, connecting him with a crisis hotline, a shelter with available beds, and most importantly, the knowledge that someone had heard him. As Marcus promised to drive to the shelter instead of the bridge, Henry felt the familiar cocktail of exhaustion and purpose that defined his nights. The next caller was Linda, a nurse finishing a double shift at OHSU, needing to decompress after losing a patient. Then came Robert, a widower who couldn't sleep because his empty house echoed with 40 years of shared life. Each call was a thread in the tapestry Henry wove nightly, connecting isolated souls to something larger than their individual pain. He played music between calls, Bill Evans for Linda, Johnny Cash for Robert, something soft and instrumental for the city itself as it moved through the small hours. At 3:47 a.m., during a particularly beautiful Ella Fitzgerald ballad, Henry noticed movement outside the station's street-level windows. A figure stood under the streetlight, looking up at the building. Henry's booth faced away from the street, but the security monitors showed a young woman, maybe 30, with a backpack, and the kind of stillness that suggested she'd been standing there for a while. The building was locked after hours, accessible only with a key card. Henry watched the monitors as the woman approached the door, then stepped back, then approached again. Finally, she pressed the after-hours buzzer. Henry rarely had visitors. The night shift was his sanctuary precisely because it existed apart from the physical world. But something about the woman's hesitation, the way she kept looking up at the building, made him curious. He activated the intercom. "Can I help you?" Are you Henry Coleman from Midnight Melodies?" Her voice was younger than most of his callers, but it carried a familiar weight. "Yes, this is Henry. The station's closed, but if you need to talk, you can call the main line." "I tried calling. I've been trying for weeks, but I can never get through. She paused, and Henry could see her gathering courage on the monitor. "You saved my life 3 years ago. I wanted to thank you." Henry's breath caught. In 15 years, no caller had ever sought him out in person. The anonymity was part of what made the show work. Voices in the dark, connections without consequences. "What's your name?" he asked gently. Emma Torres. I called you in March 2021. I was in a really dark place." Henry's memory was good, honed by years of remembering listeners' stories. But March 2021 had been particularly brutal. The pandemic had isolated everyone, and his phone lines had been flooded with people drowning in loneliness and fear. Against his better judgment, Henry buzzed Emma into the building. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, and through the booth's window, he watched her approach. She was younger than her voice suggested, with kind eyes, and the careful posture of someone who'd learned to carry heavy things. Henry opened the booth door, something he'd never done during a live show. "I remember you," he said, and suddenly he did. "You were calling from Seattle. You'd lost your job, your girlfriend had left, and your mom was in the hospital with COVID." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "You talked to me for almost an hour. You missed 3 commercial breaks. You told me that sometimes the only job we have is to make it to tomorrow." The memory came flooding back. Emma had called on one of Henry's hardest nights, when the weight of everyone else's pain had nearly crushed him. But something about her voice, young, scared, but fighting, had connected with him differently. "You made me promise to call you back in a week," Emma continued, "and I did. And you remembered me. You asked about my mom, about the job interviews. For 2 months, you checked in on me like I mattered." Henry felt something shift inside his chest, a door he'd kept carefully locked, beginning to creak open. "You did matter. You do matter." "My mom recovered. I found work. I moved to Portland last year, partly because I wanted to be in the same city as the voice that kept me alive. I listen every night." For the remaining 2 hours of his shift, Henry did something unprecedented. He let Emma stay in the booth. She sat quietly in the corner watching him work, occasionally offering a small smile when he glanced her way. Her presence changed the rhythm of the show in subtle ways. He found himself speaking more gently, choosing music with more hope than usual. When a caller named David rang in, struggling with addiction and homelessness, Henry noticed Emma listening intently. During the commercial break, she quietly said, "There's a recovery center on Martin Luther King Boulevard that helped my cousin. They take walk-ins." Henry passed along the information, and David's voice brightened with the first real hope Henry had heard from him in months of calls. As 6 a.m. approached and the morning show host arrived, Emma stood to leave. "Wait," Henry said. Would you like to get coffee? I know a place that opens early." Emma smiled. the first genuinely happy expression he'd seen from her. "I'd love that." The diner on Southeast Division was nearly empty at 6:30 a.m., just a few early commuters and service workers ending their shifts. Henry and Emma sat in a booth by the window, watching Portland wake up around them. "I never expected to meet you," Emma said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. "You were this voice in the dark, you know? I wasn't sure you were real." Henry laughed, surprised by the sound of his own amusement. "Sometimes I'm not sure either. I've been doing this so long, living in the night shift, that daylight feels foreign." Emma told him about her life now, a job at a nonprofit, an apartment she loved, a slowly rebuilding relationship with her family. She talked about the ways his voice had anchored her during the worst period of her life. "You probably don't realize," she said, "but you do more than play music and take calls. You create the space where people can be honest about how hard it is to be human." Henry felt tears threatening, an unfamiliar sensation. "I never thought about it that way." "Maybe that's why it works. You're not trying to fix anyone, you're just present." Over the following weeks, Emma became a regular presence in Henry's life, not in the booth, but in the small spaces around it. She'd wait for him after his shift sometimes, and they'd have breakfast while the city came alive. She introduced him to her world: art galleries, weekend farmers markets, places where people gathered in daylight. Henry discovered that caring for someone face-to-face didn't have to drain him the way he'd feared. Emma understood his work, respected his need for solitude, but also gently challenged his isolation. "You've spent 15 years taking care of everyone else," she said one morning. "Maybe it's time to let someone take care of you too." The changes in Henry's life began to affect his show. His voice carried new warmth, and callers noticed. The phone lines were busier than ever, but the conversations felt lighter somehow, more hopeful. One night, a caller named Patricia mentioned how much the show had changed recently. "You sound happier, Henry. It makes the rest of us feel like happiness is possible too." 6 months after Emma first appeared outside the station, Henry made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. During his show one Thursday night, he shared something personal with his listeners, the first time in 15 years. "Portland, I want to tell you something. 3 years ago, a young woman called this show during one of the darkest periods of her life. A few months ago, she found me to say thank you. That conversation reminded me that the connections we make, even in the dark, even with strangers, they matter more than we know." He paused, looking through the booth window where Emma sat reading, having stopped by after her evening shift. "Emma, if you're listening, thank you for reminding me that taking care of others and taking care of ourselves aren't opposites. They're part of the same thing." The phones lit up immediately, callers wanting to share their own stories of unexpected connections, of strangers who'd changed their lives, of the ways kindness rippled through communities in invisible waves. Henry still hosted Midnight Melodies, still took calls from insomniacs and night shift workers, still played the songs that helped people through their darkest hours. But now, his life had shape beyond the booth. He had Emma, and through her, a growing circle of friends. He had morning coffee and weekend plans, and the radical idea that he deserved the same kindness he offered others. The late-night radio show remained his calling, but it was no longer his whole world. And somehow, that made him better at it. The voice that had always offered comfort to others now carried the warmth of someone who understood that healing happened in connection, not isolation. One night, as he signed off his show, Henry looked out at the city lights and smiled. Somewhere out there, people were listening, feeling less alone because someone had chosen to stay awake with them. And for the first time in years, Henry knew he wasn't alone either. The voice in the dark had found its way to the light. This is a fictional story inspired by the real power of human connection and the quiet heroes who offer comfort in our darkest hours.